Chippenham was supposed to be safe, a royal hall, a winter court, a place where the cold stayed outside the walls and the future could wait until spring. That night, the fire was low, the benches were full, and for a few fragile hours, it almost felt like the world had rules again. Then, the rules vanished. Guthrum didn't come with a challenge shouted across a field. He came the way storms come, fast, quiet, and exactly where you don't want them. Doors that should have been barred weren't. Guards who should have been ready were still waking. And suddenly, the sound outside wasn't the usual winter wind, but the hard rhythm of men who had already decided the outcome. In the old poems I loved as a boy, the hero meets the enemy at a chosen ford. He stands with his friends. He makes a speech that sounds like fate. He doesn't gather his wife and children and disappear into the dark. But that is what I did. Not because I wanted to run, because a king isn't only a man with a sword. A king is a line, a living thread of law, memory, and belonging. If that thread snaps, Wessex doesn't just lose a battle, it loses its future. And if Wessex falls, the idea of an England that can speak with its own voice becomes nothing more than a rumor told by frightened people around dying fires. So we slipped out, my family, a handful of loyal men, and whatever we could carry without slowing the horses. We didn't take the straight roads. We took the routes no one wants in winter. We chose the places where land turns to water and water pretends to be land. Somerset in that season is not a landscape, it's a test. The marsh takes sound and returns it wrong. Every step is an argument with mud. The air tastes of iron and rot. Even the sky feels heavier there, as if the clouds are pressing down to see whether you'll break. Later, people would decorate those days with stories. They would tell tales of a humbled king, of small humiliations meant to make rulers look more like everyone else. Maybe those stories comforted them. Maybe they even happened. What I remember is simpler and harder. I remember the weight of silence. I remember the cold that doesn't fight once, but keeps biting until you stop noticing. I remember looking at the faces around me, men who had lost homes, families, certainty, and realizing they were watching me not for comfort, but for direction, as if my posture alone might decide whether their fear became surrender. In moments like that, belief stops being a banner and becomes a question. I was a Christian king. I prayed because I had been raised to pray, because prayer gave shape to the day when everything else felt shapeless. But I also understood something that a modern mind would recognize immediately. Panic is contagious. So is discipline. If I wanted Wessex to survive, I had to stay steady enough for other people to stay steady too. At Ethelme, this patch of higher ground in a sea of reeds, we built a small fortress. Not a palace, not a city, just a place that could hold a handful of men and the idea that the kingdom still breathed. From there, I began again. Not with heroics, with information. I sent scouts and messengers like sparks into wet darkness, quiet men who knew which villages had strength left, which eldermen still held their nerve, which shires could be trusted to rise if given the chance. I needed to know where Guthrum was strong and where his grip was only fear and habit. And while I gathered that knowledge, I refused to let Guthrum rest. Small bands moved out from the marsh to strike at the edges of his control, not seeking glory, not seeking a grand clash, but reminding him and everyone watching that Wessex had not disappeared. In modern language, it was pressure and disruption. In the language of my time, it was simply survival made active. People like to imagine that the past was divided into simple camps. Christians here, pagans there, good men on one side, villains on the other. But when you are cold, hungry, and hunted, the world is not simple. It becomes practical. It becomes about who can protect you, who can feed you, who can keep you alive until next week. That winter, many submitted to Guthrum. I don't judge them. Submission is often another word for trying to keep your children breathing. The real question was whether they would still submit when they saw their king again. Spring came like an insult. The world turned green as if nothing had happened. And that was the moment I knew hiding would no longer preserve the line. Hiding only teaches people how to live without you. So I left Ethelme a road to Egbertstone, near the edge of Selwood, where the forest breaks and the open land begins. I didn't know who would come. I didn't know whether Wessex still believed in me. Then I saw them. Men from Somerset, men from Wiltshire, men from Hampshire, weather-worn faces, eyes that had spent months watching horizons. And when they recognized me, alive, standing, calling, they didn't cheer like a crowd at a festival. They breathed. You could feel it, like a room that had been holding its breath too long. Despair had spread through Wessex because despair always spreads when authority disappears. But in that clearing, with those men gathering around a stone older than our wars, I understood something clearly. A king's first job is not to be fearless, it is to be visible, to be the center that people can return to. Once the army was assembled, we moved fast. Guthrum was no fool. He knew I was rising. He chose where to meet me, taking the high ground at Edington, digging ditches, preparing a position that forced us to fight uphill. It was the kind of choice a serious commander makes, the kind that says, if you want your kingdom back, pay for it. We arrived beneath that hill with a host defending its own home, and that matters. In modern terms, it's morale, it's supply. It's the difference between men fighting for plunder and men fighting for their families' farms, their churches, their language. The weapons were not romantic. Shields, large, round, heavy, locked together into a wall. Spears, common, practical, thrusting over the top, searching for weakness. Swords were there too, but mostly in the hands of the wealthy. What decided the day wasn't a single duel. It was discipline. It was whether the line could hold when lungs burned and arms trembled and the hill seemed endless. At dawn, I rode along my men and spoke plainly. No poetry, no prophecy, just the words they needed. Hold. And the wall began to move. We climbed into the ditches, into the press of bodies and wood and iron, into the long struggle where every step costs effort, and every mistake spreads like fire through dry straw. The air filled with breath and shouts, with the scrape of shields and the steady push of men refusing to dig ground. For a long time it felt like the hill itself was our enemy. But Wessex had reached the point where there was nowhere left to step back. That is the strange strength of a last stand. It removes the illusion of choice. It turns fear into focus. And somewhere in that grinding pressure, inch by inch, breath by breath, the balance began to tilt. Not because fate suddenly smiled, not because a miracle appeared in the sky, but because a defending army, gathered from its own land, led by men who had chosen not to disappear, can sometimes outlast the confidence of an invader who believes the story has already ended. That morning at Edington, the story did not end. It began again.
Before Edington, before the marsh, before the flight from Chippenham, before I became the kind of king people only understand after a kingdom nearly disappears, I was simply the youngest son. I was born in Wantage, in Berkshire, in the year 849. No one looked at my cradle and saw a crown. They saw arithmetic. I had 4 older brothers. In our world, succession was not a dream, it was a line, and I was far back in it. So my childhood was not shaped by expectations of rule. It was shaped by the rhythms of a royal household, the movement of the court from estate to estate, the steady presence of priests and warriors, the smell of smoke in great halls, the sound of hoofs on winter roads. And in the middle of that life, I found something that would follow me longer than any warband: a book. My mother, Osbor, brought out a volume of English poetry, our own tongue, our own stories, the old songs that carried heroes across centuries. She set it before my brothers and me like a challenge and a gift. She said she would give the book to whichever of us could memorize it first. My brothers were older, stronger, more confident. They thought the prize would fall into their hands by right of age. But the moment I saw it, something inside me caught fire. Not ambition, wonder. I took the book to my tutor, and I learned it the way a starving man learns the shape of bread, quickly, completely, as if it might vanish if I blinked. I stood before my mother and recited the lines. And when she placed the book into my hands, it felt like more than a child's victory. It felt like a door opening. Modern people sometimes forget what a book meant in the 9th century. A book was not leisure. It was power. It was memory you could carry. It was law that could outlast a witness, prayer that could outlast a priest. Most of all, it was proof that something could endure in a world where so much burned, broke, or was simply forgotten. That love of words stayed with me. Even when there were no teachers to give me what I wanted most, Latin, the language of the church and the learned world, I carried the hunger for learning like a second heartbeat. Then, while I was still a boy, I saw the wider world. Twice I traveled to Rome. The first time was in the early 850s when my father, King Aethelwulf, sent me to the Eternal City to be shaped by the spiritual and intellectual authority of the papal court. Later, I traveled again, and on one of those journeys we visited the court of Charles the Bald across the sea. Those were not simple voyages. Roads were uncertain, weather was unforgiving, and every border meant new risks. But what I saw on those journeys never left me. In Rome, authority felt ancient, like stone. It wasn't only about warriors and oaths. It was about institutions, clerks, libraries, rituals, law written down and preserved.
At the Frankish court, I saw another kind of strength, organization, an intellectual machine that could produce documents, maintain records, train men for governance. It wasn't perfect, no kingdom is, but it was a different kind of power than the one we relied on in Wessex. Years later, when I would try to pull my own kingdom back from the edge, I would remember those courts as a man remembers a lighthouse after surviving a storm. My father died in 858. One by one, my brothers ruled, Aethelbald, Aethelbert, and then Aethelred. In those years, Wessex still looked like a kingdom that might last. There were harvests, councils, church feasts, disputes settled by oath and judgment. The world still pretended to be stable. Then the sea changed its mind. In 865, a force arrived that would reshape everything. Our chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, not because every man in it was a monster, but because it did not behave like the raiding bands we were used to. This was not a swift strike for silver and cattle. This was an organized host, disciplined, ambitious, prepared to stay. And that distinction matters. A raid is a wound. A host is an illness. At first, they wintered in East Anglia and extracted horses. Mobility is everything in war, and the Danes understood that as well as any modern strategist. Then they moved north, toward York, and in York they found something that invaders always look for: division. Two rival kings, Osbert and Aella, were locked in conflict, burning their strength against each other while the real threat gathered outside their walls. The Danes took York, and when the Northumbrians finally tried to respond and were late, desperate, and disunited, the attempt collapsed, and Northumbria bent under the new power. The fall of York was not only political, it was cultural. Monastic centers and schools suffered. Libraries, those fragile storehouses of memory, vanished. To lose books is to lose the ability to argue with the future. When people later asked why learning seemed to dim in those years, this was part of the answer. Next came pressure on Mercia, and then catastrophe in East Anglia. There came Edmund, marched out and was defeated. Later generations would remember him as a martyr. And whether you see him as saint or simply as a man overwhelmed by forces larger than his realm, his death carried a message that everyone understood. The old England was breaking. To the people of the time, it must have felt like the end of days, not because they were foolish, but because patterns were collapsing all at once. Trade faltered, monasteries weakened, leadership changed hands too quickly, and everywhere the same lesson repeated: a kingdom without unity is a kingdom waiting to be reorganized by someone else. In Wessex, we watched these kingdoms one by one, and we understood the approaching shape of our own danger. Yet knowing the shape of danger is not the same as stopping it. You can see a storm over the sea and still be unable to change the wind. By the time the war pressed into our borders, I was no longer merely a younger prince with a love of books. I was a commander beside my brother Aethelred. I learned the brutal basics of leadership, that courage is common but discipline is rare, that a single mistake in timing can cost a province, that fear spreads faster than any horse. And I learned something else, something modern people recognize instantly. The battlefield is not only land, it is morale, it is information, it is logistics. It is the story people tell themselves about who is winning, who is protected, who has a future. That is why the Great Army was so dangerous. It didn't just take territory, it stole confidence. All of this happened before I wore a crown, before I ever had the right to make policy, to call councils, to decide whether to fight or bargain. I was watching, learning, and slowly realizing that Wessex was not simply another kingdom on the map. It was becoming the last place where resistance could still be organized. And that is the cruel irony of my life. I began as the child no one expected to rule, the youngest son with a book in his hands, yet the world around me collapsed so quickly that I grew into the only option left. When people later ask how a kingdom survives an existential threat, they often want a single answer, a single battle, a single heroic moment, a single great man. But the truth is harder, and it begins here, long before Eddington, when a boy learns that words matter, when a prince sees Rome and understands institutions, when a young commander watches other kingdoms fall and realizes that survival will demand more than bravery. It will demand change. And the storm was still coming.
In the year 871, the war stopped feeling like a distant pressure and started feeling like a hand around Wessex's throat. The Vikings had already taken so much of England that people spoke of the north as if it had become another world. But when they established themselves at Reading, digging earthworks, raising timber, anchoring their strength along the river routes, it was no longer a story from far away. It was a fortress aimed at the heart of my kingdom. My brother, King Ethelred, and I rode out with the West Saxon host to meet them. If you imagine medieval war as constant heroic charges, forget it. Most of the time it was marching through mud, counting men, listening for news, trying to arrive at the right place before the enemy did. Even then, you could still lose, simply by arriving tired, late, or hungry. At Reading, we tried to push them out of their camp. The ground was wrong for us: ditches, ramparts, prepared positions. Their defense was tight and practiced. We pressed forward and were forced back with losses we could feel in the silence afterward. It was a blunt lesson. Courage was not enough to break an enemy who had built himself a shield of earth and planning. But the Vikings didn't stay behind their defenses. They wanted something decisive. They marched out into open country, confident after Reading, ready to force a battle that would finish Wessex the way other kingdoms had been finished. We met them at a place called Ashdown. The land there rises and rolls like the back of an animal. Chalk hills, thin winter grass,
cold air sharp enough to sting. And on that slope stood a lone thorn tree, small and stubborn, as if it had decided to watch the fight and outlast whoever won. In later years, writers would turn that tree into a symbol. At the time, it was simply there, an odd landmark on a day when every detail burned itself into memory. The Vikings took the higher ground first. That is always an advantage. You feel it in your calves and lungs before the first shield even touches another. You feel it in the way your men look uphill and understand, without speaking, that they will have to spend their strength just to arrive. Our host formed below the ridge. Shields came up, spear points tilted forward. The line tightened until men stood so close that one breath belonged to two bodies. And then something happened that still divides opinion. My brother, delayed, attending Mass. Some will call it saintly. Some will call it dangerous. I will tell you what it felt like from where I stood. It felt like time itself had become the enemy. We were ready. The Vikings were ready. And the gap between readiness and action can be a deadly place. So I took command of my wing and moved. There is a modern way to describe what happened next. Force, friction, momentum, human endurance under extreme stress. But no modern language fully captures the reality of a shield wall when it closes. It is not a duel. It is not a dance. It is pressure. Wood against wood. Iron against iron. Breath trapped inside helmets. The line shoving forward in inches, not yards. A spear sliding over a shield rim, searching for an opening, then snapping back as the enemy's shield catches it. Feet braced hard in the cold earth. Men leaning their whole weight into a formation that is only as strong as the weakest shoulder inside it. To keep a shield wall steady, you don't need men who are fearless. You need men who can keep doing their job while afraid. For a long time, neither side truly moved. The wall held. The wall suffered. Then the fight began to tilt, as these things sometimes do. Not with a trumpet blast, but with a small weakness spreading through a line. The Vikings wavered. We pressed. The ground beneath the thorn tree became a place of fierce closeness, the kind where you can hear the enemy breathe. Eventually, the Viking line gave way. They withdrew. Some of their leaders fell. One of their prominent commanders, Bagseg, is remembered as dying there. The chroniclers later wrote of divine favor. I won't argue with faith, but from a modern point of view, I see other forces at work too. Discipline, formation, and the desperate energy of defenders fighting for their own land. For a moment, it felt like we had done what no one else had done, broken the invaders in open battle. But war is not a single moment. War is what happens after the moment. Within weeks, the Vikings reorganized. They returned to the field with the same cold persistence they had brought to every kingdom before us. The fighting continued. Battles came quickly, too quickly for comfort, too quickly for healing. Men who had survived one class were expected to stand again before their bruises had faded. That year would later be remembered as a year of relentless engagements. The details blur even in my memory, because exhaustion does that. When your world becomes marching, bracing, and listening for horns, days lose their names. The landscape becomes a series of positions, a ridge, a ford, a camp, a road. What mattered most was the truth beneath the blur. The situation did not change enough. We could win a day and still be losing the war. And the Vikings had something that made them even harder to defeat: speed. They moved quickly by horse and river, striking where they pleased, forcing us to chase them across our own countryside. The strain of that kind of campaigning isn't only physical, it is political. Every time an army is raised, farms are left short-handed. Every time a village is raided, confidence drains away. Every time an alderman is called to fight, he wonders whether the king's strategy will protect his own land or sacrifice it. In that climate, kingship becomes as much about holding your own people together as it is about facing the enemy. Then the blow came from within the family. By Eastertide, my brother Ethelred was dying, worn down by wounds and by the weight of a reign fought under constant invasion. I stood beside him in those final days and felt something I had never felt as a younger son. Not ambition. I felt inevitability. The crown was coming to me, not because anyone had chosen me first, but because the storm had already taken the others. That is how leadership often works in crisis. The position finds the person who is still standing. When Ethelred died, the grief was real, but there was no room for it to settle. A kingdom at war does not pause for mourning. It simply changes hands and keeps moving, like a wounded animal that can't afford to stop. The council looked to me. I could see what they were measuring, not only my bloodline, but my steadiness, my ability to command men who were tired, and to persuade men who were doubtful. In modern terms, they were testing whether I could maintain legitimacy under pressure, because legitimacy is what keeps a defense from collapsing into private survival. My coronation was not a celebration, it was an acceptance of burden. The church was cold, the candles burned steadily. The words of the rite sounded ancient and heavy, as if they had been spoken over many doomed kings before me. When the crown was placed, it did not feel like becoming greater. It felt like becoming responsible for everything that could still be lost.
Outside, there was no cheering like a festival. Faces were tight. Men bowed their heads because that is what they did, but their eyes asked the real question: can you keep us alive? I walked out into that gray light as King of the West Saxons, knowing that I was inheriting a war already in motion, a war that had consumed other kingdoms and now wanted mine. And I understood something with painful clarity. If Wessex was to survive, it could not survive on isolated victories like Ashdown alone. It needed endurance, it needed structure, it needed a way to fight not only with courage, but with continuity. That realization didn't make the next days easier, but it gave them a direction. Because once you accept that the war will not be won by one great moment, you start preparing for the kind of victory that lasts, the kind built not only on a battlefield, but in the way a kingdom organizes itself to resist being broken. And that was the task waiting for me, starting immediately, with no time to breathe.
By the middle of the 870s, the war in England was changing shape. It wasn't only raiding anymore. In the north and east, Scandinavian armies were beginning to settle, to divide land, to turn temporary camps into permanent power. And inside that shifting world, one man rose as my most dangerous opponent: Guthrum. He wasn't a mindless destroyer. He thought like a ruler. That's what made him different, and what made him so hard to stop. A raider wants to take what he can carry. A would-be king wants to take the board itself. In the year 876, Guthrum moved into Wessex with a clear purpose. He pushed into Dorset and established himself at Wareham, choosing a position that forced me to react on his terms. To the outside eye, it can look like two armies clashing, because that's what armies do. But the truth is simpler and colder. He was testing my kingdom for weak points: roads, river routes, towns that could be trapped, local leaders who might hesitate. I brought my forces in quickly and tried to contain him. The problem was never a lack of courage. The problem was that Guthrum understood time and movement. He could shift faster than I could gather, and he was always looking for the moment when my attention split. Then the sea threatened to split it for him. A Viking fleet appeared off the coast, intended to reinforce Guthrum and tighten the trap around Wessex. If that fleet arrived safely, it would have made everything heavier. More men to feed, more fighters to spread across my countryside, more pressure on every decision I made. But the sea has its own judgment. A storm broke over the coast near Swanage, and a large part of that fleet was wrecked. I didn't need to defeat it. I didn't even need to see it. Nature did what no army can promise to do. It removed an entire threat in a single night. Even now, when I think of that moment, I don't imagine God or Thor laughing over the waves. I imagine the cold, indifferent power of water, how quickly it can turn confidence into helplessness. Guthrum withdrew toward Exeter, and once again I moved to contain him. Exeter was different from Wareham. It had older defenses, Roman stone and stubborn walls, built long before this war. I chose not to throw my men into a rash assault. Instead, I placed my forces so Guthrum could not easily feed his army. In modern terms, it was containment and denial. In the language of my time, it was simply refusing to let him live off my land. Eventually, Guthrum offered terms. He gave hostages as assurance, and he swore an oath, not casually, not with a smile, but with ritual weight. He swore on a sacred ring, the kind of object the Danes treated as more than metal. Among them, a ring could be a bond, a witness, a thing that carried honor. And I believed at least enough to act. Not because I was naive, but because kings must sometimes gamble. Wessex was exhausted. My people were tired of marching, tired of fear, tired of losing sons to a war that refused to end. An agreement, even temporary, could buy time to harvest, to breathe, to strengthen positions. But Guthrum taught me a lesson I never forgot. He broke the oath. In the night, his men turned on the hostages. They slipped away under cover of darkness and moved again, using the same speed, the same cold discipline, the same understanding of surprise that had made them so dangerous from the beginning. That betrayal didn't only cost lives. It poisoned a kind of trust that rulers sometimes have to borrow, even from enemies. After that, I understood with absolute clarity. An oath is not a wall. It is not a fortress. It is words spoken in air. An air cannot stop a knife, or a march, or a winter raid. Still, I continued the campaign. I kept pressure on Guthrum. I blocked his supplies where I could. I refused to let him roam freely. But war is a long argument, and this argument was wearing Wessex down. At home, discontent grew. Some of my nobles believed I was too willing to negotiate, too willing to pay for time. The Archbishop of Canterbury complained to Rome about the burdens placed on church lands. Even among loyal men, there were muttered questions about whether I was the right king for this age.
From a modern perspective, this is not surprising. When a society is under constant threat, it searches for simple answers. It wants a single villain, a single mistake, a single person to blame. And the easiest person to blame is the leader standing in front. There are even hints, whispers, and later interpretations that some high-ranking nobles may have considered removing me. Whether those whispers grew into a real plot or remained only a dangerous mood, the result was the same: unity frayed. And when unity frays, the enemy doesn't need to be stronger than you. He only needs to strike at the right moment. Guthrum found that moment at Christmas. Chippenham was my winter court. It was meant to be secure, a place where the year could turn quietly and the kingdom could gather itself. It was also, in that season, a place of routine. Routine is comforting. It is also dangerous, because routine teaches people when to relax. Guthrum came with a kind of precision that makes a commander truly terrifying. No grand warning, no formal challenge. He arrived as if the darkness itself had been recruited. His men moved fast through sleeping streets. The shock wasn't only the sight of armed figures, it was the realization that safety had been an illusion. If you want a modern comparison, think of a state that loses its capital in a surprise strike. Think of what happens to confidence when people see that the center can be reached. That is what Guthrum attacked. Not only my forces, not only my wealth. He attacked the story that Wessex could protect itself. In the old poems I loved as a boy, the hero stands in the hall and fights his way out with shining words and a stronger arm. But a king is not only a man. A king is continuity. If I died in that hall, the war would not become nobler. It would become easier for Guthrum. So I chose the only option that still protected the future. I fled. Not in panic, in necessity. I gathered my family and the small core of men who remained close and loyal. We took what we could carry without slowing the horses. We did not ride down the main road like a procession. We slipped out through the back, into the winter countryside, and toward the places no invader enjoys. Somerset in winter is not friendly land. It is marsh and reed and water that pretends to be ground. It swallows sound, it confuses direction, it punishes anyone who tries to move too quickly. That is why we went there, because Guthrum's strength was movement across open land, fast riding, sudden strikes, quick retreats to strongholds. In the marsh, his speed meant less, his horses meant less, his certainty meant less. We moved through forests and wet fields into the cold breath of the levels. The air tasted like iron, the ground clung to boots. Every step felt like the world trying to pull us under. And yet, even in that bleak landscape, one thing became clear to me. Wessex had not ended. Not while I still lived, not while a handful of men still followed, not while any shire still remembered its own name. Guthrum could take halls, he could take towns, he could even convince frightened people to submit. But he could not take the one thing he needed most, finality. Because as long as the king remained, the kingdom still had a center. And somewhere out in that marsh, cold, hunted, reduced to almost nothing, I began to understand what the next phase of this war would require. Not another bargain, not another oath, not another fragile hope that the enemy would keep his word. It would require something stronger than words. It would require a comeback built on structure, on information, on discipline, on the kind of preparation that makes surprise less profitable. That winter, I was forced into the mud and darkness of Somerset, but in that darkness, the future of Wessex was already taking shape.
At Athelney, I stopped pretending that survival was about courage alone. Courage mattered, yes, but courage without a plan is just a short-lived fire. In the marshes of Somerset, with Wessex scattered and Guthrum sitting in my winter hall, I had to rebuild the kingdom the only way it can truly be rebuilt in a crisis, from the ground up, with information, discipline, and time used like a weapon. Athelney was barely an island, just a patch of higher land surrounded by reed beds and cold water channels. We raised timber defenses and kept the fire small. The marsh carried sound in strange ways, so every shout felt like it might travel farther than it should. We learned to move quietly. We learned to watch the horizon the way hunted men do, never with panic, always with calculation. From that place, I began again. I sent scouts out like sparks into fog, not to seek glory, not to charge into some heroic fantasy, but to answer the questions that decide whether a kingdom lives. Who still has heart? Which shires can muster men? Which roads are watched? Where is Guthrum strong and where his authority only fear? I also refused to let Guthrum rest. Small bands went out to strike at the edges of his control, short, sharp actions meant to remind him that occupation isn't ownership. We didn't linger. We didn't chase trophies. We moved with purpose, then vanished back into terrain that swallowed us. It was the kind of fighting the Vikings understood well. This time, we used it too. People later tell stories about those months as if they were a legend, simple, neat, satisfying. But the reality was colder. Food was scarce, sleep was broken. Every cough sounded loud at night.
And the hardest part wasn't hunger or weather. The hardest part was uncertainty. Because while we hid in the marsh, many in that region submitted to Guthrum. You can't judge them easily. Submission is often what survival looks like when the state can't protect you. A farmer who yields grain to an occupier might not be choosing a side. He might simply be trying to keep his children alive until the next sunrise. What mattered was whether those same people would rise when given a reason to believe again. Spring came as if nothing had happened. The world turned green, the birds returned, and the marsh began to smell less like death and more like wet life. That change in the land gave me the one thing I needed most: movement. After Easter, I made the decision that hiding could no longer preserve the crown. Hiding only teaches people to live without you. So I rode to Egbertstone, a meeting place near the edge of Selwood Forest, where woodland gives way to open roots. I arrived without certainty. A king can give orders, but he can't command loyalty the way he commands a formation. Loyalty has to meet you halfway. Then I saw them coming. Men from Somerset, men from Wiltshire, men from Hampshire. Not a single perfect army, just groups, bands, shire forces gathering in the way a wounded kingdom gathers itself, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid hope might be a trap. When they recognized me, alive, standing, calling them to form, the reaction wasn't loud celebration. It was something more powerful. It was relief. You could feel it in the way shoulders lowered and eyes brightened, as if despair had been holding the land in a chokehold and suddenly loosened its grip. In that clearing, I understood what leadership looks like in its rawest form. It's not speeches, it's presence. It's being the center people can return to when everything else has splintered. Once enough men were gathered, I moved fast. Guthrum was not an enemy who waited to be found. He watched as sharply as I did. He understood that my return meant a counterstroke, and he chose the place where he would try to end me: Eddington. He took a hill position and reinforced it with ditches and earthworks, simple engineering that forces an attacker to pay for every step. It meant we would climb into disadvantage, into fatigue, into a fight shaped by his planning. When we reached the base of that slope, I rode along my line and looked at the faces of my men. Most were not wealthy. Most did not own fine swords. They carried what common war demands: round shields, spears, a few axes, perhaps a saix at the belt. Their strength was not in shining weapons. It was in discipline. And discipline was something Wessex still had. I spoke plainly. No poetry, no prophecy. Men do not need poetry when their lives are on the line. They need clarity. Hold. Then the wall moved. The shield wall is not a heroic image. It is a machine built from trust. Each man is both defender and support. If the line breaks, it breaks through bodies, not through banners. That is why its power is also its terror. You don't fight alone, you endure together. We advanced uphill and measured steps. The ground fought us. The ditches forced the line to compress and reform. When the walls met, it was not a spectacle. It was pressure. Wood grinding against wood, iron scraping, breath trapped in helmets, spear shafts flexing as they searched for gaps. In modern terms, it was physics: weight, leverage, fatigue, momentum. But in that moment, it felt like something older too, like weird, the force the old Druids spoke of, tightening around every decision. For a long time, it seemed neither side would give. Then, slowly, the balance shifted. Not because of magic, not because the sky opened and chose a winner. It shifted because a defending army fighting for its own land can sometimes endure longer than an army fighting for expansion. It shifted because my men had nowhere left to step back to. It shifted because the line held. When Guthrum's formation began to yield, we did not scatter into reckless pursuit. We pushed forward with enough control to keep the advantage. We drove them back toward their stronghold at Chippingham. And then I did something just as important as winning the field. I refused to let the victory become a moment. I turned it into a result. We seized livestock and supplies, logistics, not romance. We surrounded Chippingham and settled into siege. We waited. After about a fortnight, Guthrum capitulated. This is where many people expect a story of vengeance, but vengeance is not governance. A king must think beyond the satisfaction of the moment. I demanded terms. Hostages were given, none were required from me. Guthrum agreed to leave Wessex, and then came the ceremony that later generations would repeat like a refrain: baptism. Near Aller, close to the marsh that had hidden me, Guthrum and leading men submitted to Christian baptism. Guthrum took the name Athelstan, and I stood as his godfather. Was the conversion sincere, or was it a political surrender dressed in sacred cloth? A modern mind doesn't have to choose one answer. In this world, faith and politics were intertwined. A man could accept baptism as strategy and still be changed by it over time. He could accept it as theater and still be bound by the expectations it created. What mattered most for Wessex was not Guthrum's heart, it was Guthrum's limits. Eddington didn't end Viking power in England. It didn't erase the settlements forming in the north and east, but it ended something crucial: the idea that Wessex could be finished quickly, like the other kingdoms. It bought me time. And time, used properly, can become a weapon stronger than any blade. When Guthrum withdrew to East Anglia and his people began to settle there, the island entered a new phase. England was no longer simply resisting raids, it was living with a partition of power, Wessex holding the south and west, Danish rule consolidating elsewhere. But Wessex had survived the moment when survival seemed impossible. And for me, that meant the real work could finally begin, because the battle at Edington saved the kingdom. What I did afterward would decide whether it stayed saved.
After Edington, people like to imagine everything became simple, as if one battle settled the fate of an island. It didn't. What Edington gave us wasn't an ending. It gave us a pause, a narrow window where Wessex could breathe again. And when you've spent years fighting a fire that keeps leaping from one roof to the next, a pause is not comfort. A pause is time you either use well or waste forever. The truth was plain. England was no longer one contested land. It was becoming two different worlds pressed against each other. To the north and east, Danish power had taken root. To the south and west, Wessex still stood. Between them, there was no solid wall, only roads, rivers, and the fragile agreement that both sides would stop pushing, at least for a while. That's what a treaty really is in wartime. Not peace in the modern sense, not friendship. It's an attempt to turn chaos into something measurable. In our case, that measurement often followed ancient lines, river boundaries, and long straight roads that had existed before any of us, Roman roads cutting through fields like scars that never healed. Later people would speak of places like Watling Street as if it were destiny, but in practice, it was geography doing what geography always does, offering rulers a convenient place to draw a line and say, this far, no further. From a modern point of view, it looks like a partition. Two powers exhausted by conflict, each unable to erase the other without unacceptable cost, choosing a boundary that might hold long enough for life to continue. It wasn't noble, it was necessary. In Wessex, I sent riders and messengers with sealed documents, charters, instructions, warnings, because the kingdom had to learn to act like a system again. War had taught us how quickly everything collapses when people stop believing the center can protect them. If you want stability, you must show stability in 100 small ways, every day. So the roads mattered, the gates mattered, the watch rotations mattered. A guard handing off a spear at dawn mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it told everyone watching that Wessex was organized, that the kingdom still had muscle memory. On the other side of the boundary, Guthrum, newly baptized, newly rebranded, newly seated in East Anglia, began to look less like an invader and more like a king. Whatever you believe about his conversion, the practical result was clear. His people were settling. Ships pulled up on shore and stayed there. Tools came out. Timber frames rose. Families moved with the host. Camps became halls. Halls became administration. That shift is easy to misunderstand if you only think of Vikings as raiders. Viking is something you do, not something you are forever. In those years, the same hands that once held oars and weapons began to hold plows and measuring ropes. Some of it was forced by circumstance, some driven by ambition. Either way, it meant Scandinavian power in England was no longer temporary. In East Anglia, boundary stakes were driven into soil, simple wooden posts that changed lives more permanently than any battlefield could. Once land is divided and assigned, conflict takes on a new character. It stops being only about taking. It becomes about holding. And along the border, ordinary people felt that change first. A road that used to be just a road became a checkpoint. A river crossing became a place where you were watched. A market became a negotiation of nerves. Traders learned which side of the line could safely buy wool, salt, grain, iron. Guards on both sides learned to read faces, to decide who was a traveler and who was a scout, who carried goods and who carried trouble. That was the strange new normal, peace enforced by suspicion. At times it worked. You might see an English farmer exchange grain with a Scandinavian settler. A weighed piece of silver might pass from one hand to another. A cautious nod might stand in for trust. Not friendship, just the shared understanding that life is easier when you don't burn your own future. But the border also carried silence. Men who had fought each other now stood on opposite sides of the same road, spears grounded, shields resting, watching. The wind moved the grass between them as if the land itself was trying to smooth things over. It didn't smooth anything over. The sea still existed, and the sea does not respect treaties. That was the thought that stayed with me in those years. A boundary on land might hold for a season, maybe for years,
but ships could always appear where you least wanted them. Even when the horizon was empty, the horizon had a way of feeling like a threat. So I treated the partition not as a victory, but as an opportunity. Wessex had been forced to accept an imperfect settlement because the alternative was ruin. But now that we had time bought by a battle and sealed with ritual, I was determined to use it. To rebuild what had been damaged, yes, but more importantly, to rebuild what had been missing. Order, routine, institutions, the quiet machinery of a kingdom that can respond before panic spreads. So in villages, people began repairing roofs and fences. Churches reopened their doors. Fields were planted without the constant expectation that everything would be taken before harvest. The sound of hammers returned, not for weapons alone, but for homes. These are the details that matter, because they're the details that tell you whether a society is healing. And in Wessex, the healing was cautious. No one who lived through those years assumed safety was permanent. People didn't forget. They simply learned to live with memory while building anyway. Meanwhile, across the line, Danish settlements grew more confident. Not necessarily more aggressive, just more rooted. You could see it in the way new halls were raised, in the way local assemblies gathered, in the way authorities shifted from war leaders to administrators. From a modern perspective, this was the birth of a new political landscape, not a clean England versus Vikings story, but a complex mix of cultures, laws, languages, and loyalties. That complexity is important. It's what makes the period real. Because history is rarely a single struggle with a single ending, it's often the slow work of managing consequences. Edington did not erase the Danelaw. It defined it. It did not end fear. It turned fear into preparation. And it did not make Guthrum my friend. It made him something more useful in the moment, a rival who accepted limits. When I sat at my map table in those years, I didn't see a triumph painted in bright colors. I saw a fragile balance. I saw roads that could become invasion routes, rivers that could become lifelines or traps. I saw markets that might rebuild wealth, and border crossings that might become flashpoints. Most of all, I saw time. Time gained is not peace. Time gained is a resource. And in the late 9th century, with England divided and the sea still restless, I understood something with a clarity that feels almost modern. If Wessex was going to survive the next storm, and there would always be a next storm, then the kingdom had to become harder to surprise, harder to exhaust, and harder to break. The treaty drew a line across the land. My task was to make sure that line, however imperfect, gave Wessex enough strength to endure what came after.
After Edington, I learned a hard truth that still makes sense to a modern mind. You don't defend a country with bravery alone. You defend it with systems. Systems that keep working when people are tired, frightened, and tempted to give up. In the years that followed, I didn't treat the respite as a reward. I treated it as a countdown. Because I knew the sea would not stay quiet forever, and because I had seen what happens to kingdoms that rely on luck, speeches, and single victories. So I started rebuilding Wessex the way you rebuild a vulnerable structure in a storm-prone land. You reinforce the weak points first, then you connect everything into a network. The heart of that network was the burh. A burh wasn't just a fort on a hill. It was a defended place positioned with purpose, near river crossings, road junctions, market towns, and routes an enemy would naturally use. Some burhs were built fresh, others reused older sites, Roman walls, Iron Age earthworks, because a sensible builder doesn't ignore foundations simply because they're ancient. I wanted a kingdom where people didn't have to run for days to find safety, where a raiding force couldn't glide inland and strip the countryside before anyone could respond, where the enemy would find not empty fear, but resistance waiting in stone and timber. That required building on a scale some of my own people didn't love. Fortifications demand labor, labor demands time, and time demands sacrifice, especially from communities who would rather repair farms than raise walls. But I had lived through the alternative. I had watched villages burn and councils fracture, so I insisted. When you look at it with modern eyes, it's clear what the burst system really did. It shortened reaction time. It made defense local, not just royal. It created nodes that could hold supplies, shelter people, and serve as rallying points for the field army. It made Wessex more like an organism with a nervous system, able to feel and respond quickly instead of discovering danger after the damage was done. Fortifications alone, though, are not enough if your army is always exhausted. So we restructured service. We couldn't afford to pull every able man away from his land for long periods. A kingdom that can't plant and harvest will lose even if it wins battles.
So we divided obligations so that one part of the force could be on duty, while another stayed home, maintaining farms, guarding local positions, and keeping life from collapsing into famine. It's not glamorous, but it's the kind of practical solution that keeps a society alive under pressure. Modern militaries would call it sustainability. I simply called it survival. We also turned our attention to the coast. The Vikings had always understood what England's rivers and shorelines offered: speed, surprise, escape. If I wanted to make Wessex less attractive to them, I had to contest that advantage. We experimented with ships, larger builds, sturdier hulls, vessels meant to meet raiders on the water rather than always chasing them after they landed. Naval fighting in our time was uncertain and harsh, but the message mattered as much as the results. Wessex would not leave the sea unchallenged. And then there was the other half of my strategy, the part some people still struggle to connect to war. Books. Learning. It may sound like softness beside earthworks and spears, but I came to believe it was part of the same defense. Because a kingdom without literacy cannot coordinate well, it cannot preserve law, it cannot train capable administrators, it cannot maintain legitimacy when fear spreads rumors faster than writers. During the years of invasion, learning in the South had declined sharply, not because people suddenly became foolish, but because institutions had been disrupted. Monasteries were raided, libraries were lost, clergy were scattered. A society under constant attack doesn't invest easily in education. I refused to accept that decline as inevitable. So I gathered scholars. Men from Mercia, men from Wales, men from across the sea, learned clerics who carried books like treasure because, in a sense, they were treasure. One of them was Asser, a Welsh monk whose friendship and writing would later become essential to how people remembered my reign. Others brought different traditions and skills. Together, they gave my court something it had been missing: an intellectual engine. We read, we argued, we questioned. They read Latin texts aloud to me, and I listened like a student because that is what I was, an adult king trying to repair not only walls, but the mind of his kingdom. At a certain point, I began translating. Not for vanity, not to show off, but because English needed to carry wisdom that had been trapped in Latin for too long, especially when so few could still read it. If you want leaders who can govern responsibly, you must give them access to the ideas that shape responsibility. That is why works like Gregory the Great's writing on pastoral care mattered to me. It wasn't simply a book for bishops, it was a book about what authority demands: humility, discipline, moral seriousness, the kind of values a king needs when the temptations of power and the pressures of war are both trying to twist him. Boethius mattered to me as well, his reflections on fortune, suffering, and meaning, not because I enjoyed sadness, but because a ruler in crisis needs a framework for understanding why disaster happens without becoming either arrogant in success or broken in failure. And Augustine's inward questioning mattered too, because the war had proved something painfully obvious. The greatest threats are not always outside the walls. They can be inside: fear, division, selfishness, despair. Translation was only part of it. We also established teaching. A royal school where my children and the children of noblemen, and even some lesser-born boys, could learn to read English properly, and in time to approach Latin. This wasn't charity, it was statecraft. I wanted future leaders who could think clearly, communicate precisely, and understand law and scripture without relying entirely on whoever happened to stand beside them. In modern terms, it was an investment in human capital. In my terms, it was making sure Wessex would not lose itself, even if it survived the next war. The most important thing about all these reforms is that they were connected. They weren't separate projects, some military, some cultural. They were one strategy aimed at the same problem: vulnerability. The burrs made it harder to invade quickly. The rotating service kept the army sustainable. The ships challenged the coast. The learning revival rebuilt administration, morale, and identity. Together, they transformed Wessex from a kingdom that could be surprised and battered into one that could absorb shocks and keep functioning. There is a myth people love about kings, that greatness appears in one shining moment: a battle, a speech, a single decision that changes everything. But when I look back with the clarity of age, I see something less dramatic and more powerful. Greatness, if it exists at all, is built in the unglamorous work between crises, in walls raised by tired hands, and watch rotations kept on cold nights, and lessons taught to children who will one day make decisions we cannot control. Eddington saved Wessex in a day. What came after was my attempt to make sure Wessex stayed saved in the years that followed, because the sea never stops moving, and neither does history.
For a while after Eddington, it almost felt as if the sea had learned restraint. Wessex rebuilt. The burrs rose like stitched seams across the land. Roads were watched, river crossings were guarded, markets reopened under the shadow of walls. Learning returned to halls where only silence had lived. If you stood on a rampart at sunrise and watched smoke rise from hearths instead of from burning roofs, you could almost believe the crisis had passed. Almost. Because peace in the 9th century wasn't a condition, it was an interval. And then, around 890, the first hinge turned. Guthrum died. For years after his defeat, he had been a contained threat. Still a rival, still a Danish king in East Anglia, but one who understood limits. His death didn't remove danger, it removed predictability. It opened a space, and in that space, ambition rushed in. From a modern point of view, it's easy to see the pattern. When a strong figure disappears, the system he held together is tested. New players interpret the moment as an invitation. And a sea, which had always been the Vikings' greatest ally, was still there, wide, restless, and full of ships looking for a better future. Across the Channel, Viking bands had been active for years in Frankish lands, raiding, negotiating, settling, fighting, being pushed back, returning again. They suffered defeats and hardship. Hunger and pressure changed their calculus. And England, wealthy, fragmented, remembered, started to look like an opportunity that couldn't be ignored. In the year 892, that opportunity arrived in the worst possible way, not as one spear point, but as a coordinated threat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a great fleet entering the estuary of the River Lyman in Kent, at the edge of a vast forest the locals called the Great Wood. The chroniclers speak of numbers, large enough to crowd an estuary with masts, and whether every tally is exact or not, the meaning is clear. This was not a raid, this was a new campaign. The invaders rowed their ships upriver and established a fortified base at Appledore, in a place that was difficult to reach quickly from the heart of Wessex. Remote, forested, wet, a perfect pocket for an enemy who wanted to move without being seen. And then a second force arrived, smaller but still formidable, pushing up the Thames and building another base at Milton. 2 camps, 2 river routes, 2 doors opened at once. If you want to understand why this was so dangerous, imagine being responsible for a modern state and learning that 2 separate hostile forces have established beachheads connected to your road network, one through heavy woodland, one through the major river artery of the region. You don't just face an enemy, you face a dilemma. Wherever you place your strength, the other flank looks suddenly exposed. And I was older now, more experienced, yes, but also carrying the cost of decades. I had learned to govern, to build, to think beyond the next battle, but I had also learned how quickly a kingdom can unravel when people believe the center cannot protect them. That memory never leaves you. I gathered my army and moved with a cold kind of urgency. The Chronicle says I positioned my main force between the 2 Viking camps so I could reach either one. That sounds simple on parchment. In reality, it meant balancing speed and supply, guarding against sudden breakout, and keeping your own men from growing exhausted before the real fighting even begins. It was not glamorous leadership, it was logistics and nerves. The Vikings tried to do what Vikings always did best, spread out in small bands and exploit gaps. They moved through the Great Wood, slipping along paths where the king's army couldn't be everywhere at once. Their aim was clear: get into open country, find weak villages, take supplies, generate fear, and force me into chasing shadows. But this time, Wessex was not the same kingdom they had entered years before. The burhs mattered now, garrisons mattered, local forces mattered. The countryside was no longer a wide open pantry. Where a raiding band expected easy plunder, it found closed gates and armed men. Where it expected to vanish down a road, it found a fortified place positioned like a clenched fist. The Vikings could still strike, but they could not strike freely, and they could not strike without being pursued. This was exactly what the reforms were designed to do, not to stop every incursion, but to deny the enemy the benefits of speed and surprise. Still, the situation was dangerous. 2 strong enemy bases on my doorstep, and the memory of how close Wessex had come to collapse. So I did something that might seem strange if you only know me as the victor of Eddington. I negotiated. I met with the Viking leader who had become the face of this new threat, Hásteinn. He was not Guthrum. Guthrum had been an aspiring king, willing to settle and rule. Hásteinn was a different kind of adversary, charismatic, mobile, difficult to trap. The sort of commander who does not need to win one great battle to be successful. He only needs to keep you spending strength. The Chronicle says hostages were given. It says even Hásteinn's sons were handed over and baptized, with myself and my Mercian ally, Ethelred, standing as sponsors. It even says payment was made. To modern ears, that sounds like a step backwards. Why pay again after all that had happened?
But here's the truth. Negotiation is not always trust. Sometimes it's just a tool you use when you're trying to control timing and risk. I had seen a kingdom nearly die once. I was not eager to gamble everything again simply to satisfy pride. I hoped, perhaps, that Hastane could be turned into another Guthrum, another rival willing to accept limits, another threat redirected into settlement rather than total war. But Hastane was not looking for a stable arrangement. He crossed the Thames, moved into Essex, and set up at Benfleet, and then, quietly, efficiently, he resumed pressure. Not always with dramatic battles, but with movement, theft, and fear. The old pattern returned, a commander who slips away from the blow, who forces you to chase, who refuses to give you closure. Meanwhile, the wider problem grew. The Viking forces were not static, they shifted. The larger host at Appledore eventually tried to join Hastane in Essex, and as if two camps were not enough, another threat appeared, Vikings from Northumbria and East Anglia landing at Exeter, far to the west. That was the moment when the war became what modern analysts would call a multi-front crisis, the kind that breaks states, not because the enemy is unbeatable, but because the defender cannot be in two places at once. So we split our response. I moved toward Exeter to face the new landing in the west, while my son Edward, young, untested, but no longer a child, took the field against the forces moving through the south. That decision carried its own risk. A young commander can win glory, but he can also make one mistake that costs a kingdom. Yet leadership is also about succession. A realm that cannot train the next generation is only borrowing time. This was the moment when my reforms would either prove their worth or be exposed as impressive ideas that failed under pressure. And beneath all of it, I felt something older than strategy, the same cold question that had driven me into the marsh years before. Can Wessex endure another storm? As the enemy camps tightened their hold, and the roads of Kent filled with armed movement, I could see the shape of the coming months, not one heroic clash, but a long campaign of pursuit and containment, a test of discipline, a test of coordination, a test of whether the kingdom we rebuilt could withstand a pressure designed to make it panic. In my tent at night, with a candle trembling over a map, the situation looked less like a story and more like a board of hard choices. Appledore, Milton, Benfleet, Exeter. Different directions, different threats, all connected by rivers and roads. I placed the markers close together and held my hand still, because sometimes the most honest moment in leadership is not the order you give. It's the moment you admit, silently, that the next phase will test everything you've built. And the sea, as always, waited to send whatever it pleased.
When the second storm finally hit, it didn't arrive as one clean, heroic battle. It arrived as a campaign, messy, shifting, exhausting. The kind of war that's decided less by a single clash and more by who can keep thinking clearly when everything feels stretched thin. By the early 890s, Hastane had become the name that haunted the coastline. He wasn't Guthrum. Guthrum had aimed to rule, to settle, to build a kingdom in East Anglia and live inside a treaty's limits. Hastane was something else, restless, elusive, and impossible to pin down for long. He didn't need to conquer Wessex in one blow to be dangerous. He only needed to keep Wessex off balance. The pressure began to shift in the spring of 893. The Viking host that had landed in Kent moved to join Hastane in Essex, concentrating strength near Benfleet. Rivers became roads again, estuaries became corridors. The enemy used water the way modern forces use highways, fast movement, sudden direction changes, and the constant ability to slip away before you can commit to one response. At the same time, threats appeared elsewhere. Far in the west, near Exeter, another Viking force landed, forcing me to split attention. The crisis became what today we'd call multi-front. Not one problem, but several, happening at once, each capable of becoming catastrophic if ignored for too long. So I did what the circumstances demanded. I went west to face the threat at Exeter, and I gave my son, Edward, the chance and burden of leading men in the south. He was young, but not a boy, and if Wessex was to outlast me, it needed a leader who could command under pressure, not only inherit after the pressure had passed. Edward met Viking forces near Farnham. The fighting was hard and close, the kind that doesn't look like a heroic charge, but like disciplined lines colliding, shields locked, spears thrusting over the rim, men bracing their feet in churned ground while the world shrank to the space of a few steps. Edward held his nerve. He forced the enemy back and drove them towards the Thames. It was his first major test, and he passed it. But war is never satisfied with one success. Victory brings its own problems. Edward pursued the Vikings to a place called Thorny Island, a marshy refuge where they could fortify themselves quickly. He began a siege, and here the old weakness of our military system showed itself even after years of reform. Men could fight bravely for a time, but they still had homes, farms,
obligations. Their service was not endless. Provisions ran low, the grumbling began, not because the men were cowards, but because reality has a voice. An army cannot starve for honor. That siege might have collapsed into failure if not for the arrival of Aethelred of Mercia, bringing fresh forces from London. He didn't arrive like a savior in a tale. He arrived like a partner in a hard alliance, bringing food, manpower, and the simple fact that a siege can only continue if you can sustain it. With Mercian support, the English held position, and the Vikings agreed to withdraw from the immediate area. It wasn't the kind of ending poets prefer. It was the kind of ending that happens when pressure worked. Then came Benfleet. While Edward and the Mercians held the situation in the south, Aethelred led a strike on Haschain's base. The attack succeeded in taking the fort's contents, supplies, goods, and the non-combatants who traveled with the host. The Viking ships were destroyed or captured. Haschain himself, as always, slipped away. That was his talent, not just violence, survival. You could hurt him, you could take his base, you could strip him of what he had gathered, and still he would reappear somewhere else, forcing you to start the chase again. He established another camp near the Essex coast, then made a move that was as bold as it was dangerous. He marched across England toward the Welsh border. Think about that with a modern mind. A hostile force moving through defended territory, avoiding decisive engagement, crossing rivers and roads, and arriving near a frontier where alliances are complicated. It was a gamble on speed and nerve. And for a time it worked. Severn at Buddington. There he was close to Welsh lands and not far from regions where Danish influence already existed. It was the kind of placement that could have opened new possibilities if he had been allowed to breathe. But this was no longer the England of the early 870s. The kingdom had learned. West Saxons, Mercians, and Welsh forces converged. It was a coalition that earlier generations would have thought unlikely, old rivalries set aside because the alternative was worse. Fear, when shared, can build alliances faster than diplomacy ever could. The siege at Buddington wasn't a dramatic series of assaults. It was pressure, encirclement, denial, the slow tightening of options. Foraging became impossible, supplies then. A camp that cannot feed itself cannot remain a threat for long. Inside, the Vikings were forced into desperate measures. Outside, our men kept watch through cold nights, fires low, spears grounded, waiting for the moment when the trapped force would try to break. That moment came at first light, in fog. Haschain attempted to break out. The lines met in brutal closeness, shield against shield, bodies braced, spears pushing into gaps. The fog swallowed distance, making it hard to see more than a few steps ahead. In that kind of fighting, discipline matters even more than strength, because you're always one confusion away from your line twisting out of shape. Our coalition held. The Vikings were dragging back. Losses were heavy. And once again, predictably, Haschain himself escaped with part of his force. It's tempting to feel frustration at that, but from a strategic view, the result mattered more than the man. The host was broken as a cohesive threat. The campaign was turning against them not through one perfect victory, but through sustained pressure and coordinated defense. Even after Buddington, the danger wasn't fully gone. Late in the decade, Viking forces tried to establish a new strong position north of London on the River Lee, hoping to gain freedom of movement by controlling waterways. They understood what rivers meant. So did I. By then I was older and often in pain, but I went to London, and I chose a response that says everything about how the war had changed. I fought with engineering. We built earthworks and barriers on both banks to block the river route, turning the Lee from a highway into a trap. It was not glorious, it was patient, it was effective. The Vikings tested the obstruction, realized the advantage of the river was gone, and gradually dispersed. In 896, the great pressure finally eased. Not because our enemies became kinder, but because the kingdom we rebuilt had become too difficult to exploit. Raiding no longer produced easy reward. Movement was contested, supplies were denied, strongholds were everywhere, garrisons reacted quickly, and our alliances held. That is what victory looked like in the end. Not a single moment of triumph, but the enemy deciding the game was no longer worth playing. When I look back on that campaign with a modern eye, I see something clear. Haschain didn't lose because he lacked courage or cleverness. He lost because he faced a system, fortifications linked by roads, local defense tied to royal strategy, alliances strong enough to close gaps, and leadership willing to use time, labor, and geography as weapons. It wasn't romance that ended his storm. It was structure. And by the River Lee, with the water misting in the cold air and the earthworks rising on both banks, I understood the final lesson of my reign. A kingdom survives not by winning one fight, but by becoming harder to break every time the enemy returns. That was the victory I had been building since the day I fled into the marsh.
After the year 896, something unfamiliar settled over Wessex. Silence. Not the empty silence of surrender, but the quieter kind that comes when the coastline is watched, the roads are guarded, and the enemy begins to look elsewhere for easier prizes. For the first time in years, I could wake without expecting a messenger to burst through the door with news of smoke on the horizon. That doesn't mean danger vanished. It never does. The seas still carried men with hunger in their hearts. Pirates still tested our shores. But the difference was this: they no longer arrived to find a kingdom surprised and scattered. They arrived to find a kingdom that had learned how to stand ready as a habit. There was a moment around that time, one of those sharp reminders that peace is never permanent, when our ships met raiders off the coast. It wasn't a grand, sung-about battle. It was hard work on dark water, sails straining, ropes biting into hands, hulls shuddering with each wave.
Men moved with the steady discipline of crews who understood that one mistake at sea can be final. We captured ships, we brought the threat under control, and when it was over, I did something earlier in my reign I might not have done. I made it clear that Wessex would not treat repeated piracy as something to be bought off or forgiven. In modern language, it was deterrence, a message sent not in words, but in consequences. That same year, I felt an unfamiliar weight lift, only to discover what lay beneath it. Because war doesn't just take men and money. It takes time. It takes attention. It takes the quiet space in which a ruler can think about anything beyond survival. When the attacks finally eased, I realized how old I felt. Not in years alone, but in the kind of tiredness that settles into bone after decades of crisis. So I returned to the work that had always studied me, even when armies were marching: books. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the hall quieted, I turned again to translation. I spent time with the Psalms, words of grief and endurance, words that admit fear without surrendering to it. There are lines in those texts that feel as if they were written for kings who have watched their world collapse and still had to lead men the next morning. People sometimes imagine a warrior king as if his life is nothing but banners and shouting, as if the mind rests only when the body is exhausted. But I came to believe the opposite. A mind must be trained for hardship, or hardship will train it badly. That is why learning mattered to me until the end, not as decoration, as defense. And in those later years, my court became something I once saw only in Rome and in the Frankish lands, a place where knowledge moved alongside power. Scribes copied texts, clerks organized records, teachers trained children who would someday bear authority. A kingdom cannot remain strong if its memory is weak. One of the most striking moments of that late peace came when a visitor arrived from far beyond our usual horizons. A Norwegian trader named Othere came to my court and described the far north, lands of cold light and long winters, of reindeer herds and distant peoples paying tribute in hides and bone and rope made from whale and seal. His account didn't sound like war. It sounded like survival shaped by geography. I remember watching my scribes lean in, quills moving quickly, as if the world itself was expanding on the page. To modern ears, this might seem like a small curiosity, just a traveler's tale. But for a ruler, information is never small. A king who understands how other peoples live understands something about the range of human possibility. And there was something quietly important in that visit. It reminded us that the Scandinavian world was not only raiders, it was also traders, sailors, families, and men trying to build wealth without always taking it by force. So even in peace, I kept learning, and I kept my kingdom learning, because I knew the future would belong to those who could adopt. As the years closed toward the end of the century, I leaned more heavily on the next generation. My son Edward was no longer an experiment. He had fought, he had commanded. He had seen what it costs when an army cannot be sustained, and what it means when allies arrive in time. My son-in-law Ethelred of Mercia had proven himself again and again. My daughter Ethelflad carried the steel of her line as surely as any man. This was not just family pride, it was continuity. A kingdom is not saved by one king. It is saved when the structures he builds survive him. And then, quietly, my body began to refuse, or my will still demanded. In my last days, I was still surrounded by the tools of my life: a cross, a book, a map, the soft scratch of a quill in the next room. But breathing became harder, strength thinned. The mind that had spent so long measuring threats and building responses began to turn inward. There is no drama in that, only truth. When I died, toward the end of the 800s, Wessex did not collapse. That is how I knew the real victory had been achieved. The system held. The people gathered, the bells rang, the streets of Winchester filled with a silence heavier than any speech. Men who had once doubted, men who had once grumbled, stood still and lowered their heads because even they understood what had been at stake and what had been preserved. They carried my body through the town in solemn procession, clergy and nobles, guards and common folk, all moving at the same measured pace. Inside the church, candles burned and incense rose, and the words of the rite wrapped the moment in something older than politics. Then Edward took the crown. Again, not with a festival of certainty, but with the calm seriousness of a man inheriting unfinished work. Because that is what kingship really is, unfinished work passed from one pair of hands to another. If people later call me the Great, that title does not belong to me as a man. It belongs to the idea that Wessex did not become a memory, that England could still grow, still unify, still speak its own language, still pray in its own churches, still remember its own stories. And if you ask what truly outlived me, it wasn't a single battle. It wasn't even Edington, though Edington mattered.
What outlived me were the things built in the quieter years, the fortified towns that turned panic into refuge, the reorganized service that kept fields planted while armies marched, the ships that made the coastline less helpless, the schools and books that rebuilt a mind for the kingdom, not just a sword arm. A ruler is temporary, a system can be lasting. In the end, that was my final lesson, one that feels almost modern. You cannot stop every storm, but you can build a country that doesn't drown when the storm returns.